Welcome, everyone. Greetings. Welcome. Folks are slowly joining in. So we'll just allow a few seconds for others to join. Welcome. Greetings, everyone. My name is Kimberly Phillip, and I am a National Human Rights Representative with the Canadian Union of Public Employees, also known as Cupe. And welcome to this evening's event that is being hosted by Cupe, the International Solidarity Committees of both Cupe Ontario and Cupe British Columbia, Cupe BC. We are really, really grateful that you took time out of your schedules to be with us today as we have these ongoing conversations about what it means to be in solidarity with Palestinian people, with Palestinian workers, and with the global movement calling for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israeli goods to support Palestinian freedom and Palestinian liberation. We are really, really grateful that you are here with us this evening. As we are gathering, Indigenous land defenders are reeling from yesterday's violent attack by the RCMP, as the RCMP breached two structures at Coyote Camp on Casique territory, where they violently arrested Gitmitin spokesperson Slado, along with Denise Wu's daughter, and several other unarmed Indigenous land defenders. And all of this is on behalf of TC Energy's proposed Coastal GasLink pipeline project. At the height of the invasion, there was a media and communications blackout that was enforced at gunpoint, cutting contact from the outside world. The previous day, on November 18th, a militarized raid employed dozens of tactical officers, K9 units, assault weapons, buses, and surveillance vehicles as they breached the first line of defense of the territory. They made 15 arrests, and those arrests included 2 elders, 3 legal observers, and 1 journalist. All eyes are needed on Wet'suwet'en as the genocidal violence continues, and they are asking for solidarity from across Turtle Island. What does it mean for an increased presence of land acknowledgements when everyone is saying land acknowledgements, territorial acknowledgements? What does it mean to engage in that act when colonial violence continues unchecked? Let us keep this in mind as we reflect on the territories that we are currently residing on, working from, living on, that we now occupy. And I think about my placement here on Treaty 13 lands, where the current treaty holders are the Mississaugas of New Credit First Nation. The territories that we have the privilege of living on, this is not our home. These are the homes of many Indigenous peoples and nations, and it is incumbent on us to really think about and to really act in deep and radical solidarity. I just want to remind you of a few guidelines before we dive into tonight's conversation. At union meetings, at Cupe meetings, we remind members and staff of the principles and values that help ensure a harassment-free and violence-free space. This shows up in our equality statements, and it also shows up in our code of conduct. This evening, we will not be reading the Code of Conduct or Equality Statement, but we just want to invite you all to really act in ways that honor respect, harassment-free spaces, courage, and deep compassion. And we want you to know just upfront that no harassment or disrespect or any form of discrimination will be accepted or tolerated in this space this evening. And that's for all of our safety and all of our well-being. So with all of that said, I'm now going to invite Fred Hahn and Karen Ranaletta to speak. Fred Hahn is the president of Cupe Ontario, and Karen is the president of Cupe BC. And I'll now pass it on to the two of them to provide some opening and welcome remarks.
Great. Thank you so much, Kimberly. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you tonight, and it's really a pleasure to be here in person here with my friend Fred Hahn. I want to acknowledge that we are here together on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nations, colonially known as Vancouver. Again, my name is Karen Ranaletta, and as president of QPBC, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you and our colleague Rory Gill as well from the National Executive Board, as well as the panelists and all the organizers. I want to thank you for being here with us today on this webinar talking about solidarity with Palestinian people and workers and the BDS movement. This is a really important conversation for us to have, especially ahead of resolution number 70 at the Cupe National Convention, which starts next week. And I want to just take a minute to read the resolution, because I think it's important to understand the context of what we're going to be doing. And so the resolution says that Cupe National will support the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and their demands to, 1, end Israel's military occupation and colonization. 2, grant Palestinian refugees their UN-stipulated right to return to their home and properties. 3, recognize full equality for Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. And number 2, work with unions and civil society to demand the Canadian government to exert pressure on Israel to stop violating international law, end building and expanding settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, and ethnic cleansing of Indigenous Palestinians. And finally, number 3, support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign until Israel abides by international law and ends its illegal occupation of Palestinian land. I want to point out that this is a really great moment in our history of having both the Cupe Ontario and Cupe BC International Solidarities come together on this important, issue that's really has a long history of support in both of our regions. Cupe BC has a long history of supporting Palestinian rights. I pulled up all the policy that has hit the convention floor year after year after year, and that has been supported year after year after year. As I look at all the bullet points, I'm not going to read them all, but I will say, the flavor is, at the end of the day, we are calling for, we oppose the economic boycott of Gaza, the collective punishment of Palestinian people, and support the end of Israeli occupation and the illegal settlement of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. We condemn the peace role of the U.S. between Israel and Palestine. And most recently, in 2018, we passed a resolution to support the No Way to Treat a Child campaign that exposes the widespread and systematic ill treatment of Palestinian children in the Israeli military detention system, and oppose Israel violating international law by illegally detaining Palestinians and depriving them of their basic human, civil, and political rights. These are positions that QBBC has proudly taken. Personally, I just want to say I've learned a lot from the Cupe members who went on a delegation to Palestine a few years ago. And that, to me, was extremely meaningful. And some of those relationships that occurred between the Cupe folks and the unions on the ground there are relationships that we carry forward today. And so, and you're going to hear more from that from Rory later, I'm sure. So, at the end of the day, the connections with trade unions on the ground in that region of the world are ones that our organization, it's important to us. We are united in our struggles for human rights, for labor rights, and for better global and foreign policy. And Kimberly, heeding your words that talking about what's going on up north here in the province of British Columbia, we're a lot more united in solidarity than I think we kind of think it is. And so on that note, I'm going to pass it over to my friend Fred Hahn, who also has some words for us. We just need a minute to sanitize the microphone. So thank you as we... world. Fine, that's great. All right.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Karen, and thank you all. My name is Fred Hahn. I'm the president of Cupe, Ontario, and I want to start by bringing greetings and welcome you all on behalf of the 280,000 members of Cupe in our region. And also on behalf of our region, I want to echo how great it is to be joined by comrades from the Cupe National Executive Board and by our staff from the Human Rights Department like Kimberly and many others, and by activists from our union who have been ensuring that the collective work of our international solidarity continues, whether that be in BC or here in BC or in Ontario. As we gather to discuss the ongoing solidarity and partnership between Palestinian people and the international labor movement, I also wanted to take a moment to remind us that for members in Cupe, Ontario, this is not a new issue. For more than 15 years, our members have been committed to solidarity with Palestinian trade unionists. We've been joined by Cupe BC and many other unions in Canada and around the globe. It actually started in 2001 at a World Conference Against Racism in South Africa, where delegates from Palestine worked together with delegates from South Africa to replicate their successful strategy of organizing a global boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign in order to apply pressure to the state of Israel to end the apartheid of Palestine. In 2005, Palestinian trade unionists led the way to the adoption of an official BDS call, and that was put out to international labor organizations and to trade unions all over the world. And it was shortly after that, in 2006, that a resolution came to the floor of a Cupe, Ontario convention asking our part of Cupe to support the international BDS campaign until the state of Israel recognizes the Palestinian right to self-determination. Despite growing backlash in right-wing media and powerful pro-Israel lobbyists, Cupe, Ontario delegates not only adopted that resolution, but adopted it unanimously. They set the bar high for the rest of the Canadian labor movement. And I'm pleased to say that since that time, we have continuously renewed our commitment to BDS and to justice for Palestine. And that support of Palestine has become the norm in labor Canadian trade unions. The Canadian Postal Workers Union, the CUPW, and the Canadian Public Service Alliance of Canada, two other large public sector unions, as well as Unifor, the largest private sector union in the country, have all adopted similar positions. Many federations and associations and unions in Quebec have also done so, as have many other student unions, and the Canadian Labour Congress adopted a policy in support of boycott, divestment, and sanctions this last April, in April of this year. And of course, there are many community coalition partners, many that we know and work with and respect, like Idle No More and Black Lives Matter, who've also joined this call. Many unions from across the globe, international organizations like Amnesty International, the International Federation of Human Rights, Human Rights Watch, to name just a few, have recognized the inhumane and illegal treatment of Palestinian people by the state of Israel. In the labor movement, we have a saying that goes like this: an injury to one is an injury to all. That solidarity and support is not meant only for the members of our union alone, and it doesn't end at the borders of the land that we call Canada. So I want to say thank you to the members of the Cupe Ontario and the Cupe BC International Solidarity Committee for helping to organize this event so we can talk more as trade unionists and as Cupe about what we can do, what we must do to support our comrades, our brothers and sisters in Palestine, and as we continue to oppose apartheid regimes in Israel or anywhere in the world. Thank you. I'll turn it back to you, Kimberly.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you, Karen. Before I invite our speakers to share, I just want to read a quick excerpt from a poem written by Asia Monet. And this poem is titled We Are, and she wrote this as she was inspired and continues to be inspired by the work of Mahmoud Darwish, who was a Palestinian poet. And Asia says, Move not for reason, but love. Any law that deviates from this is as cruel as it is ancient. Let your words be soothing terrors. Never mind what was written. We will rewrite it. An idea of freedom is all we know. So with that, I have the pleasure of inviting Rory Gill as well as baby Zoe. I think it's important to acknowledge her presence. And Rory is going to be speaking to us for about 10 minutes. Rory has worked in the public sector with the City of Calgary since he joined the Parks Business Unit as a seasonal parks laborer in 1997. In 2006, he became active in his local union, Cupe 709, the Calgary Civic Foremen's Union. He joined the local executive in 2011 and was later elected as the local's vice president in 2012 and then the president in 2014. At the same time, Rory was active with Cupe Alberta Division and its advocacy work for Cupe members across the province. He was then elected president of Cupe Alberta in March 2019. Rory was born in Aberdeen, Scotland, but moved with his family to Calgary as a child, where he now lives with his partner Tiffany and is the very proud father of their daughter Zoe and his children Callum and Liam. Rory traveled to Palestine with the Cupe delegation in July of 2018. And this evening, he's going to be speaking to us about his experience as part of that Cupe delegation to Palestine in 2018, and his absolute certainty that the occupation is maintaining a settler colonialist apartheid state that can only be ended through fully supporting the Palestinian people's national liberation struggle with international BDS. So with that said, I will pass it on to Rory.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. And as Kimberly has said, I've been joined a little unexpectedly with my daughter Zoe, so I may have to stand up at some point. So I apologize in advance for that, folks. But Zoe is a seasoned activist. She began marching very early on, and will continue to do so. And she's actually quite seasoned at Zoom meetings as well. So it's lovely to be with you all tonight. I would say that as Kimberly has said, I work with Cupe Alberta. I'm a proud member of Cupe Local 709. I live in Calgary, which is the traditional territories of Treaty 7. And of course, the peoples who make up that are the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Kainai, the Piikani, the Siksika people, also the Ayaksi Nakota people, and of course the people of Métis Region 3 and the Tsuut'ina people as well. And I'm speaking to you tonight from the homeland of the Musqueam people, the Squamish people, the unceded territories, I should make that clear, and of course also the Selk'nam people, as Karen has already said, and what we refer to as Vancouver. Some of you may be wondering, and Kimberly alluded to it, what's the guy from Alberta doing at a Palestinian Solidarity Forum? And I think the main reason I'm here is that I was fortunate enough to be part of Cupe's first delegation to Palestine and Israel in July of 2018. And I remember very clearly, and on that delegation, I was proudly joined by Andrew Ledger, Karen Boxdale, Connie Sorio, Kelty Cameron, Cupe's International Solidarity Officer, and our incredible facilitator and guide, Lisa Arnold of the Australian Palestinian Action Network. And I remember when Kelty called me in March of 2018 to ask if I would like to go on the delegation. I said yes before she finished the question. She mentioned it was Palestine. Palestine and the Palestinian solidarity and the struggle for Palestinian national liberation has been something I've been interested in from a very early age. And I remember very clearly in the summer of 1982, when I was 12, becoming aware of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the encirclement of Beirut, and of course the horrible massacres at the Sabra and Shatila camps in the September of 1982 by the Falange militia, closely allied with the Israeli Defense Forces. So I was very passionately interested in Palestinian solidarity and national liberation. But I will say, and I'm going to talk about this as concisely as I can, because of course we have Anna here tonight and Mo, and who have experiences that we must learn about. But I wanted to go, but I can tell you, having been there, and it was not for a very long time, it was 13 days, but seeing the situation in Palestine changes you. And, that was something that a member of the Irish Senate observed in 2018 when Ireland passed the law that said they were no longer going to accept economic goods from inside the occupied territories. But once you've seen the occupation, it does change you, even though you can be a passionate supporter of Palestinian liberation. Because once you see the systematic and quite chillingly scientific methods of oppression practiced by the Israeli state against the Palestinian people, you no longer will say things like it's a complicated situation. And that was one of the things I used to say, because yes, Palestine must be free, but it is complicated. It's not. What you have in the occupied territories, the West Bank and Gaza, are one people being oppressed by another, and consistently and over an incredibly long period of time. And I alluded to the fact I first became aware of Palestinian solidarity and liberation in 1982, and at that time it had been going on for 15 years. And I very much remember my parents saying, when is this going to end? When are we going to have justice for the Palestinian people? It's been 15 years. Well, it's now been 54 years, 2 years longer than I've been alive. So when is this going to end? And that's why we're here tonight. So I want to give you just some of the observations that I was able to make as a person, traveling in Palestine, and then talk, as Kimberly alluded to what I think we can do about it as labor activists and people in Canada. So the occupation begins pretty much from the second that you enter Palestine. And myself and the other folks in the delegation, we didn't fly into Ben Gurion Airport. We went to Amman, Jordan, and then we crossed by land at the Allenby crossing, going into the West Bank. And when that happens, you will be unaware that you are entering Palestine. It is an Israeli customs post, an Israeli security check, and there is no acknowledgement whatsoever that you are entering Palestinian territory. And there is never any acknowledgement that you are in Palestine except when you are talking to Palestinian people. One of the things that we were told, that was reinforced with us, it was very important when we were speaking to, people working for the Israeli state and the Israeli Defense Forces, not to mention the word Palestine, to not say that. And that would mean that, because it would stop things very quickly. So that was one thing I kept in mind. But you're keenly aware when you're there that you're in Palestine, because you can see Palestinian people with you, and they are the most amazing folks in the world. I've said this over and over again: the bravest, most committed people, and I'm just talking about just people you will meet every day living their lives. They have to be committed. They have to be committed to each other, because the strength it takes to put up with this systematic oppression is almost reached the limits of human endurance. And as we know, that situation is particularly acute in Gaza. And we're actually 1 year past the point where the United Nations said that people could live in Gaza. Think about that. We're 1 year past that. And then the encirclement continues, and the attacks continue. And, when people, approach the wall, they're shot dead, unarmed people. So that's the situation in Gaza. It's a little bit better in the West Bank, but not very much. And when you're there, you're again keenly aware that you're constantly under surveillance. And at any point in the occupied territories, the Israeli Defense Forces can be in force in about 5 minutes. Doesn't matter where you are, what you're doing. They can see you, either physically or through electronic means, and they can be there within 5 minutes. And that is a simple fact. So you'll quite often hear, that, well, it's again a complicated situation within the occupied territories. It's very dangerous. It's very violent. There's no opportunity for us, for people to interact on a peaceful level. Well, to a certain extent, that's true, but it's not because of the Palestinian people. It's because of, I say, the constant military presence and surveillance of the Israeli Defense Forces. And again, you're constantly aware of this when you're traveling, because of course there are settlements throughout the West Bank. And when you're there, you're aware of who's in charge, very much, and whose word goes. And it is Israelis and the Israeli state and the Israeli Defense Forces. Particularly acute if you visit Hebron. Within the center of Hebron, there are Israeli settlements, right in the city center. And there are what they call sterile zones. And sterile zones are places where Palestinian people are not permitted to go, except in very, very limited circumstances. And this truly stood out for me. And, we talk about apartheid, and that is where it is starkest, Hebron, because you can see where one group of people can live and one cannot. And I can tell you, and I've told this story before, that we had a photographer with us, Ahmed, incredibly brave guy, just a wonderful person to spend time with. But he took one of the bravest decisions and perhaps most foolhardy decisions I've seen. And I don't use that word lightly because I think it was very, very important to him. But he had grown up in the West Bank and he had not been able to walk through the center of Hebron. So he took advantage of the fact that he was with us and did it. And I was really scared for him because I really liked him and I wanted him to be okay. And thankfully he was. But that decision could have, really, it wouldn't have had any effect on us, being from Canada. Let's be clear about that. We would have been sent home and that would have been about it. But for Ahmed, it could have been, really impactful. But that's the sort of bravery that I got used to seeing from Palestinian people, and just, a simple walk could have changed the course of his entire life. But we were able to get through that. So when you think about what the situation is and how Palestinian people have to live, it becomes starker and starker the longer you spend there. And again, I was there for 13 days, but it became obvious to me, and quite again, within the first 3 or 4 hours of being in Palestine, what the situation is. There is physical attempts to separate people. We talked about the apartheid wall. It started to be built in 2006. It is, in some places, a 50-foot concrete wall. And its rationale was to stop people from entering Israel, with ill intent. Again, nothing could be further from the truth. I've seen the apartheid wall. It's used to separate people. It's used to demoralize people, and it is used to intimidate. And I can also say that one of the things I saw when we were in the West Bank, just outside of Ramallah, was we were at a thin side of the wall. It was maybe 200 meters away. But we were standing on the remains of a Palestinian apartment building, which had been completely razed to the ground by explosives and bulldozers within sight of the wall. So there was no way, shape, or form that the people who lived there could have entered. I mean, they were under surveillance. They were within sight of a 50-foot wall. But the Israeli state decided that it was time to knock down where they lived and let people again know whose word went. And that happened. So, again, there's very often the idea is that it's security that drives these decisions. It's not. It's oppression and it's intimidation. And it's intimidation, what I believe, the goal of getting to a point where people can no longer take it. And there is a limit to human endurance. And the Palestinian people have shown that it can, it can be extended. And they are brave people, but there's simply, I believe there can come a point where, what more can people take? Talked about Gaza. So I think the Israeli state has one thing in mind, which is to make the areas unlivable, to get the majority of the people to leave. And then the people left over will be, in a truly oppressed state and, used for economic reasons. And then that will be the point. And then, Israel at that point, and they're very close to it. Formally annex the place because they can say that the people they were worried about being Palestinian people are no longer there. And that is my own, analysis of the situation, but it's based on what I've seen, and I'm keen to hear what others think. So the question really becomes, with this level of oppression, what can be done? And I'm a proud Cupe member, and one of the reasons I'm so proud of being a Cupe member is I know the history of the BDS movement, and it was taught to me, by members of 3903 and 1281 and other brave Cupe locals that have been in the forefront of Palestinian solidarity and national liberation support. So it was students at the University of Toronto who really first, during Israeli Apartheid Week in the early 2000s, who put this idea forward, who made the connection that what was happening in Israel and Palestine was an apartheid state, a colonial settler apartheid state, and that the time had come for us to use the tactics of fighting apartheid, in the South African context, in the Israeli context. And, Fred has talked about the brave decision made by Cupe Ontario in 2006 to support this movement and the other trade unions that have signed on. But I simply can't emphasize enough that if people are looking for something that they can do is to learn about boycott, divest, and sanctions and become part of it. And, Karen's talked about the resolution that I hope, very much hope, will make convention floor when we start convention on Tuesday, our national convention. and we can support this, and we can take the decision that Keep Ontario made at the division level nationally. Because unless we can convince people that they can make a personal action and not support Israeli companies and companies that are in the occupied territories, and use that as a critical mass to get disinvestment, and it works. I can tell you, it absolutely works. The boycotts have led to large corporations, stopping investment in the occupied territories. And of course, the next step is to get to that critical mass and convince governments that we need to have sanctions, and we need to change the Israeli state's policy towards the people that it occupies. Until that time, we're not going to get anywhere. We just aren't. And I believe that. And if there was some other solution, I would talk about it. But I've seen this, and I say I'm 52 years old, a little baby, 2 older kids. But there we go. But as I say, the occupation's been going on for 2 years longer than I was born, and that was not the beginning of it. The beginning of it was 1948 with the creation of Israel, and the decision to occupy the lands. And I think I'm getting towards the end of my time, because I could probably spend another 20 minutes talking about the situation within Israel proper, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and the true apartheid, the absolute true classic apartheid which these people live in. And I'll have to throw in, when we were there in 2018 was when the Israeli Knesset changed the basic law in 2018. Up until that point, it was just about impossible for a Palestinian citizen of Israel to live in certain places, but it wasn't unlawful. The Israeli government at that point decided they'd had enough of skirting around the issue, and they made it unlawful. And so the changes to the basic law, and I'm going to emphasize this, are truly analogous to the Group Areas Act that you would find in South Africa from the 1950s until liberation in the early 1990s. So I think folks can see sometimes I get quite passionate about this and go on and think about what I want to say, but essentially I want to emphasize it is not a complicated situation. It is oppression and repression aimed at driving people from their homes. There is a way for us to support them. There is an effective way to do it. It's to learn about BDS and to support BDS and to stand with the Palestinian people in solidarity and support national liberation, which I will do. And I will finish by saying just about everybody I spoke to in Palestine, and I'll tell you something else, when you're there, you meet 5 or 6 people every day who are the greatest activists of your life, and they charge you up. So it is that kind of place. But everyone I talked to said, thank you for coming. Just tell people what's going on. And that's what I wanted to do. And I hope I've done that effectively. But I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Anna and Mo, who are probably much more organized than me. So thank you, folks.
Thank you so much, Rory. And I'm just so honored to be working for Cupe members who insist on having these conversations and not falling into this false idea that to critique the state of Israel is to be anti-Semitic. When we critique the state of Canada, we are not somehow racist towards Canadians. And similarly, when we critique the policies of a nation state that continues to insist on apartheid rule and apartheid practices, we are not being anti-Semitic. And so I'm just deeply honored to be serving Cupe members across Canada who continue to bravely have these conversations. So with that said, I'd love to invite Anna Lipman to the conversations this evening. Anna is a 3rd-generation Ashkenazi Jewish migrant on Turtle Island and 1st-generation settler in Canada. She's a PhD student in the sociology department at York University. Anna's research looks at identity and how young people's thoughts about themselves are influenced by the world around them. She's particularly interested in how young people use hip hop to build resiliency and mobilize for social justice, and the influences of race, gender, and class. Anna organizes with several groups in Toronto, including Standing Up for Racial Justice, also known as SURGE, Independent Jewish Voices, and If Not Now. So Anna, we would love to hear from you as you can shed some light on how labor unions can be in solidarity with Palestinians in Canada, and if you can speak a bit about BDS and the ways in which the Canadian state is complicit in Israeli apartheid.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me here tonight. I'm gonna share my screen with y'all. So
you don't have to stare at my face the whole time. Yeah, I am super proud to be here, super proud member of Cupe and 3903. I think my union has done some really great work around this issue. And I'm stoked for more labor folks to get into the conversation. I think what's really important to note is that labor has always been at the forefront of social justice movements, right? Like, labor's done so much for things like the 40-hour work week, the weekend, workers' comp, maternity leave, things like that, right? Because as workers, we realize that our humanity and our human rights is deeply embedded in how we organize, right? So it's really important to recognize that Palestine and the issues of Palestinian solidarity are really no different than any other social movement that labor gets behind. And we know that this issue of Palestinian solidarity is often framed as complex and anti-Semitic, but just as we heard before, right, this is a human rights issue. This is an issue about settler colonialism, and it's a matter of indigenous sovereignty, right? And there's really nothing about that that's complex, and there's really nothing anti-Semitic about standing up, for human rights for others and critiquing nation states, right? And so we, as labor unionists, should care about this issue, not just because it's a violation of human rights and what we stand for, but also because of the ways that we here in Canada are really complicit in Palestinian oppression. So Canada and Israel, they really share the same logic of settler colonialism, right? There's this really deeply ingrained idea in how both Canada and Israel build their nation states as good people who came to an empty place and built it up, right? While completely sort of erasing the history and humanity of the Indigenous people that were in those spaces before, right? So, it's really difficult for Canada to condemn Israel while it's simultaneously upholding the same ideologies and logics right here. And, I think that's an especially salient point today as we're witnessing what's going on in Wet'suwet'en, right? But in fact, Canada is a huge supporter of Palestinian genocide and of the state of Israel. And this happens through our arms trade with Israel, our sales of other supplies for the Israeli army, the sales of Israeli goods here in Canada that profit and support this war on Palestinians, and the continued explicit and complicit support for Israel, which we've seen, definitely in Stephen Harper when he speaks up for Israel, but also in Trudeau's lack of making statements about, Israel's war crimes and Palestinian solidarity. So, for example, when Trump wanted to move the U.S. consulate, and there was mass protests about that, Canada remained silent, right? Because Canada, as a nation state that's founded on colonialism, is really invested in keeping Israel going strong, right? Because it's the same logic that upholds both of these countries. But, there is a lot of key ways that we can put pressure on Israel and on Canada's support for Israel. And part of that is through the BDS movement, right? Boycott, divest, and sanction. So as Fred mentioned, this is a global call that's really come from Palestinians themselves. And starting in 2005, it was really kind of asked that a global solidarity movement occur in order to put pressure on Israel, both from an individual, organizational, and government level, right? And this was in part, again, inspired by the success of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement in ending South African apartheid. And so part of this movement calls for withdrawing all support for Israeli goods and services, as well as ceasing to fund Israel and the companies that are complicit in Israeli apartheid. So companies that have business in Israel, like Pillsbury and SodaStream, that work on the land and produce their products there, and also companies that do business with Israel itself, such as Hewlett Packard, that actually designed the software for the Israeli army. And so you might be wondering now, what can labor do? Well, don't worry, labor can do a lot. So, first off, like, it's so important to, again, increase awareness about these issues, and really having, learning moments and opportunities such as this panel tonight is a great way to build awareness and support for what's happening in Palestine amongst your local or your union writ large, right? Also, putting out a solidarity statement as a union, as your local, is also really important. So what I have on the screen here is the 2006 sorry, I'm losing my words. Statement that Cupe, Ontario put out to support the BDS movement, and a motion that was recently passed by Cupe 3903, so that's my local at York University, to call on York to divest from its investment in arms manufacturing. So, you can recognize like what BDS means in your workplace, whether or not that's, looking into what your company is investing in, what your pension is being invested in. We know that, the Canadian pension plan invests in Israeli apartheid. And so really making a strong statement towards your workplaces and asking them to divest from these supports, right? But also coalition building in your organization is a great way to support this movement as well. So at York University, Cupe has worked really closely with not only the faculty union, but also a lot of student groups like Students Against Israeli Apartheid and York U Divest, in order to really garner large-scale support for these issues and put pressure on our university to follow BDS, right? And so, we've seen these strategies, especially here at Cupe, work really great to build support and put pressure both here in Canada and abroad in Israel to support Palestinians and the support for Israeli occupation. And so, we as a labor movement have seen historically that when we organize together for things, we can win, right? And so imagine if all of us here, all of us in the labor movement, decide to organize around this issue and really put it at the forefront of our movements, like, we would be able to do so much, right? So I'll just end with a little quote by Marx: "Workers of the world unite, but for Palestine. Like,
Yes, thank you, Anna. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to invite Mo Al-Qassam to the conversation. Mo is a Palestinian community organizer based in Toronto and a graduate of York University. Originally from Nablus, Palestine, Mo is active in many parts of the Palestine solidarity movement, including the BDS movement, building support for Palestinian prisoners, and organizing on university campuses in the labor movement and the Arab community. Mo is also currently serving as the president of Cupe 1281. He is also the Young Workers Representative on the executive board of Cupe, Ontario. He's an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement and a writer who occasionally contributes his political analyses on the Palestinian national liberation struggle. So Mo, we want to invite you now to speak for a few minutes about recent events in Palestine and the importance of labor solidarity.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. I'd really like to start off firstly with thanking Cupe Ontario, Cupe BC, and the wider membership of Cupe across the country, and all the comrades and brothers and sisters who have contributed to this event. I'd also like to begin with extending my solidarity on behalf of the Palestinian Arab community to our siblings in the indigenous community on these lands as they're facing repression and suppression by the so-called Canadian state. With that being said, I'd also like to lastly extend a shout out to the Palestinian Youth Movement and my siblings in the Palestinian Youth Movement, a lot of whom do a great organizing across so-called North America and in solidarity with other peoples and solidarity with the struggle of the working class. I had initially plotted out my talk today to speak to how is Palestine related to us. And I think there's two ways we can approach it. We can approach it as a foreign policy issue, and we can also approach it as a domestic issue. And I think both are valid and both should be of concern to us and part of the way that we look at Palestine. We hold a very important position, a key position here in this country, as the labor movement, as the masses, and as the working people. We hold the class position. We understand very well that we are oppressed and we are exploited very often by employers and by states or a state that is unfriendly to workers and that always seeks to reap the benefits of our labor. This is no different as an analogy to the situation of Palestinians. When Palestinians are struggling against the Israeli state, they're struggling, or we're struggling, as part of a class that has been compounded by occupation, has been compounded by settler colonialism, and colonialism very broadly. We very often hear misconceptions about the BDS movement and what it entails and the repercussions of boycotts. I think very, very briefly we can address that. The BDS movement does not call for blanket boycotts against companies and products or goods that are Israeli or tied to the so-called State of Israel. It calls for boycotts on these products or companies that are directly involved in the occupation and the colonialism employed against Palestinians. We also have to look at Palestinians as, again, we mentioned Palestinians are a separate class in sort of ways. The Palestinians as of this very moment, will not be hurt by any boycott movement or by the BDS movement. As a matter of fact, the BDS movement was called upon by nearly 150 civil society organizations, unions, including trade and labor unions, and women's unions as well. Because Palestinians back home understand that there is no further exploitation that's going to happen. We're being exploited by the Israelis in terms of the state of Israel, but we're also being subjugated and made to be a reserve labor force for the Israeli state and the Israeli bourgeoisie and the capitalists. Very often, when we look at the situation in Palestine, or what folks could also refer to as Israel proper, we see that employers will hire Palestinian labor or Palestinian workers and pay them much lesser than their Israeli counterparts. We very much also always see how in the Israeli labor world, the Histadrut, the largest federation of labor in so-called Israel, does not reserve or have the same rights for Arab workers and Palestinian workers as they do for Israeli Jewish workers, which is something that we wouldn't stand for here. We wouldn't have a labor movement in this country that has rights for some and no rights for the other, or lesser rights for the other. This is something that we have to confront, and we go back to the analogy that this is both a foreign policy issue and a domestic issue. We have to come to the fact, as a labor movement and as masses and working class in this country, that part of our struggle is to also have our own distinct foreign policy that challenges imperialist and colonial notions, and that challenges the foreign policy that stems from repressive governments. And I say this at a very crucial moment while we in Ontario are facing the governments such as the Doug Ford government, or comrades in Alberta are facing repressive governments such as the Jason Kenney government. We are at a critical juncture in the labor movement. And part of our struggle isn't just struggling against employers and struggling for labor rights and human rights. It's also to find that foreign policy that makes the labor movement a real challenge for these so-called governments. It is also a domestic issue, and I know my co-panelists have also hinted at this or have touched on it. The Canadian state and different iterations or governments of the Canadian state have supported Israel, not just diplomatically and politically, but materially as well. And there's a very deeply rooted history between the Palestinian people and the South African people who have struggled against apartheid. This is part of a global struggle. We as a labor movement have to be able to challenge apartheid. We have to be challenging occupation, colonialism, and imperialism wherever it may arise. The material, the weaponry that go to Israel do not just appear out of thin air. Very often it is sold to the state by other states, including ones that we live in North America and in the West more broadly. So the labor movement has been one that is situated in a critical juncture, and it's been one that's always held the moral, ethical, and political high ground. The labor movement has been involved in anti-war struggles. We could go as far back as the Vietnam War, and how the labor movement has contributed to ending that war and challenging that war. We could look back at the labor movement and the student movement as well, that has challenged the support for the apartheid regime employed in South Africa. And today, Palestine is that litmus test. It's that test that appears once again in the history of the labor movement. And for us right now, on the eve of the National Convention, we have to answer this litmus test correctly, because history is watching the labor movement. History will be looking at the way that we vote. So when if Resolution 70 reaches the floor of the National Convention, it is now upon the workers of this country, on this land, to vote for the right choice and to situate the labor movement again in the right direction. I want to circle back very briefly to the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I think the way that we also go on strike over here, when we witness that we're being exploited and our rights are not being recognized, we stop going to work, we stop offering our labor, and we ask that the employer, that the state recognize our rights, and that the peoples in solidarity with us recognize our rights. This is very similar to how the BDS movement is deployed. The BDS movement is very much like a picket line. The Palestinian people are no longer willing to be exploited anymore. And we're asking peoples in solidarity with us to not cross this picket line. It's a very simple concept that we have every day in labor. We're not willing to cross the picket line if a fellow worker is on strike. And as we've heard before from Brother Fred, Comrade Fred, an injury one is an injury to all. And even that, if that injury is occurring at home, or if it's occurring hundreds or thousands of miles away, it's still an injury to us over here. So I urge you that when this resolution comes up, when BDS comes up, we have to make the right choice and vote yes for BDS, and yes for human rights, and yes for national liberation. I will end my talk here. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Mo. Thank you so much. Thank you to all three of you, Rory, Anna, and Mo, and thank you to Fred and Karen as well. We're going to open it up for a group discussion. So welcome back, Karen and Fred. So I've been looking at the Q&A to pull out questions. There were a number of comments, and as we mentioned earlier in the chat, the Q&A is not meant for comments, but questions directed to the panelists. And I just want to remind folks, earlier I talked about some of the guidelines and principles that we would like to operate from. And so talking about a harassment-free zone, mutual respect, solidarity, keeping in mind all of those things. I am not going to be addressing some of the comments in the Q&A because I'm going to make the decision as the facilitator and determine that they do not fall along some of those principles and guidelines. So with that said, there is a question around how to address the splits in the community when it comes to the conversation around Israel and Palestine. And so there was a question directed to Anna, but I'm going to ask all of you. Essentially, how do you address some of the polarizing ways that some people interpret this conversation or take this conversation? And how can you reassure the people that you are organizing with, that you are building with, that the demand for BDS is a just demand? So I've expanded the question so that it doesn't just go to Anna. And feel free to be brief so that we can share the space well. But essentially, how do you deal with those moments where it becomes super polarizing? How do you sort of like bridge people, if it's possible? And how do you reassure people that BDS is a just demand? And I know you spoke about this, Mo, but would love to hear your thoughts. So who would like to start? Do you want to start with you, Anna? Yeah? Okay.
Sure. I think that, it comes down to this idea of mutual safety and solidarity, right? And part of that means that anything that, says that myself, like as a Jewish person, cannot be safe unless someone else's safety, like the Palestinians, is taken away, and it frames it in this like zero-sum sort of game where, our humanity is at odds with each other. That just is a untrue and false kind of binary framing of the issue, right? I think it's important to recognize that, we are all stronger when we support all of us, right? And so, again, bringing it back to that shared humanity and that shared struggle, and recognizing that we all have a role to play in that.
Thank you, Anna. Rory, do you want to go next?
Sure thing, Kimberly, and thank you for the opportunity. I think the first thing I want to say is that as a trade union activist, as a human being, I recognize that anti-Semitism is a real thing, and it is a scourge, and it is a worldwide scourge, and we need to confront it whenever it comes up. We need to do that as a union, and we need to do that as people. And I think there could be an argument made that perhaps the trade union movement, has not been as forthright as we can, and we must confront anti-Semitism. That being said, and Kimberly, you quite eloquently spoke about this earlier on, Israel is a nation, and Israel as a government, and Israel as the fourth largest military in the world. And I believe that as Israel is a country, and it is a nation, and it makes decisions. And, its citizens, and we should acknowledge this, 95% right now of its citizens back what's going on. And that's another reason that we need to work so hard on BDS, to get a change there. But I met many, many people in Israel who don't support, and Israelis who don't support what their government and their military is doing. And I met people who had left the IDF because they could not support it, and they knew what was going on. They knew it was oppression. So it is the possibility to confront governmental decisions, national decisions, and separate that from identity. And I don't pretend that part of it's easy. I've talked about the non-complicated issue of the occupation. I understand there's complexities, and that's an understatement when we were talking about anti-Semitism and how it affects us all. But I truly believe we're talking about the actions of a state. And as I say, I will confront anti-Semitism wherever it is, and I'll stand up against it, and I'll stand with those fighting it. But I also have to acknowledge the actions of the Israeli state and what it does on a daily basis, which is oppress the Palestinian people.
Thank you, Rory. Mo, and then we'll end with Karen and Fred.
Yeah, I completely agree with my fellow co-panelists and their answers. I would also like to add that I think BDS and the fight for Palestinian national liberation and the fight for self-determination elsewhere globally is also part of the fight against anti-Semitism. And I completely agree. Anti-Semitism is something that we need to confront wherever it may appear, wherever it may come up. The very important part here is that BDS and the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, or the Palestinian Liberation Struggle, make the very important distinction between a political movement, which is Zionism, and Judaism, which is a religious identity and ethno-religious identity. We understand the difference. We refuse the conflation that is used cynically to repress other peoples, and not to speak for other folks in the same tone, but many other comrades and siblings from the Jewish community also make that distinction, and they reject deconflation, which is a very important part. And this distinction and the rejection of the conflation is part of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, and it is it's for us seeking to live side by side with other folks, with comrades, with siblings, under the same rights.
Thank you, Mo. Karen and Fred.
There we go. Thank you so much to all of you for your strong answers. I'm going to not take up too much time, except to say that what I've been thinking about and listening to today, and particularly this important question that Kimberly has raised about, as working people, so many, we are encouraged to be divided against one another in so many different ways. We are seeing this certainly at this moment in the pandemic, where people are encouraged to be divided against each other. We have seen it when it comes to the poison of anti-Black racism. We have seen it when it comes to all forms of discrimination. What is important, I think, to refocus on here is that, in fact, we see it when our members go on strike. I really appreciate it. Mo's helpful and a strongly important analogy here, that we actually have to work with our own members when our own members go on strike sometimes, because they feel as though they're being inconvenienced and they're kind of upset. It's because we are surrounded by messages that encourage us to think only of ourselves. As a union, we have this opportunity, though, when our members become union members, to help to understand that our way of succeeding as working class people here and around the world is based on this principle of solidarity, on the understanding that we must stand together. And that when people ask for our help because they are suffering an injustice, part of our job is to provide whatever solidarity we can for them. It's connected so deeply to the work we all do as trade unionists.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for responding to that question, all of you. And I know that I expanded the question, but I think I think you all covered the initial question. So thank you for that. I'm just looking at the Q&A again. There's a question around how can members support Resolution 70 at convention? And so I know this was touched on, but is there anyone who maybe just wants to explain again how members can support Resolution 70 at the upcoming Cupe National Convention? Mo, maybe you want to speak to that?
Thanks, Kimberly. I will be very brief. I think the main way that folks can support Resolution 70 is to vote yes for Resolution 70, to encourage their comrades, their brothers and sisters within labor to vote yes for Resolution 70, and to support the demands of Resolution 70 even beyond the world of labor. Resolution 70 and its components are not just exclusive to us. These are demands of justice and human rights that are universal.
Thank you, Mo. And the only thing I would add to that is, speak to other people about the resolution. If, for example, you still have questions about BDS, about whatever it is, there are so many resources available. You can check out the BDS website. You can check out the website for Independent Jewish Voices. There's so much information available. So I would just also encourage you to do some research if you can, ask questions, and the information is definitely accessible to you. Okay, so just looking again at the Q&A, there's a question. I'm gonna put it out to you all and see how you wanna respond to it. The question is, knowing how Canada still does not treat Indigenous peoples correctly. I took out our because we don't own Indigenous peoples. They're not our Indigenous peoples, just a quick heads up. So knowing how Canada still does not treat Indigenous people correctly and still has policies that are unfair to Indigenous peoples, would you support other countries creating a BDS movement against us, I guess in Canada? And would you support non-Indigenous Canadians, people living in Canada, to eventually leave the land? That's a big one. I just wanted to put it out and see if anyone wanted to address it.
Sure.
Yeah, Rory.
Oh, do you want to go first, though, or?
I went first before, so please go ahead, Rory.
Anna, are you good, or you want to go, or? Okay, I would just say that, okay, I talked about the length of time that, I've been aware of Palestinian solidarity. The injustice, and that, again, is another understatement I've used today towards Indigenous people, has been going on, again, much, much longer than I've been alive. And right now, there's Indigenous people who can't turn on the tap and get a drink of water, and nothing has happened. So yeah, there goddamn well should be a BDS movement against Canada to do something about this. And it's about time we acknowledge what we've done as a nation, that we participated in the kidnapping of children, the destruction of culture. And yeah, I would support that. And I would also say, I got to Canada as a 4-year-old. There's conversations that need to be had between peoples, as equals. But I don't take anything off the table. And there's got to be some justice for people at the end of the day. And I would just add, when it comes to our movement, we've been talking about Palestine, we're talking about Indigenous rights. You can't pick and choose justice. You have to confront it, and sometimes you have to have conversations you may not like, and then you may not be able to concede. But yeah, I don't think anything's off the table.
Thanks, Rory. Well, yeah, and then Fred.
I completely agree with Brother Rory's comments. I would also like to say that it's also very much up to Indigenous folks on these lands and these territories to make that call for themselves. And we as peoples in solidarity and as a workers movement and as a labor movement, it is for us to respond to that call. So we cannot make that call on their behalf. We show up when they ask us to show up. And that is how solidarity is built. That is how it has always been. And that's how it will always be.
Thank you, Mo. Fred?
Oh, I'll just quickly add that the way in which colonization and imperialism unfolds in different places can have, of course, differences. Mo said it eloquently, but the key difference here is that what Indigenous people have asked us to do here is to decolonize our minds and decolonize our structures and to actually seek real reconciliation in a much different way. Conflating these two things is, when we're talking about colonialism, it can be understandable perhaps, but it's an important distinction. But I just want to circle back to the point that Kimberly made at the beginning, that we are, in fact, all of us being asked to do what we can to express solidarity with those in what was that today, and land defenders in other parts of this land. I think that there are real differences that we must be guided by. There are similarities in colonialism, but there are real differences. And our job in relation to is I really try to be guided by our Indigenous members and leaders from community groups and what they are asking us to do here in reversing the colonialism that's happened in this place.
Great, thank you, Fred. Anna, did you want to add anything? Karen, or good?
I'll just say that I 100% agree with everything everyone said, and I think it's important to recognize that, you know, there were Jews living in Israel before, or in Palestine before 1948, just like the same way that migration is a natural part of who we are as humans, right? So it's less about where people live and more about really that state sanctioned and ideologically bound oppressive and colonial system, less so than I think the bodies on the ground, although that's part of it. But you know, it's about that oppression and that system of oppression that goes far beyond just living somewhere, I think.
Yes, thank you, Anna. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so again, I'm looking at what looks like questions in the Q&A. And I just want to get you all, and whoever feels capable to speak to this, if you can maybe speak to what it means to understand Israel as a state, as a nation state, and to not do so. So, for example, there's a comment that speaks to the BDS being an intentional attack to dismantle the Israeli state. And so I'm wondering if all of you can maybe just speak, or whoever feels capable, doesn't have to be all of you, if you want to speak to what it means to legitimize the state of Israel or not. Does that question make sense? Yeah? Okay. Mo?
I thank you so much, Comrade Kimberly. I disagree with the notion that BDS is deployed to dismantling the Israeli state or the so-called Israeli state. I think the BDS demands are very direct and very explicit, and so that it calls upon it to respect international and humanitarian law. It is, moreover, it is not about the Jewish state or non-Jewish state or any sort of religious or ethno-religious state. We are seeking a state, call it whatever you may want to call it. We are seeking a state where people are living under equal rights, side by side. Call it what you will. I'm speaking to the attendees and to the participants and to the listeners. Call that state what you will. Call it Canada, call it Israel, call it the United States, any other state on earth. What we ask for is very simple. Equal rights for everyone. It's not about dismantling any state. And if that state will be dismantled because there was a call for equal rights and for human rights, then maybe that state was set up on a wrong foundation to begin with. So the leadership of that state has a lot of self-reflection to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mo. So just want to remind folks that the Q&A is meant for questions and not comments. So I'm happy that people are engaging, but just want to remind you about that. So I guess what we can do now is maybe just see if folks want to just provide some closing remarks before we close. We have about 8 minutes left before we wrap up tonight's webinar. So maybe what we'll do is start with Karen and Fred, then we'll go to Rory, and then Anna, and then Mo. Okay, so just some closing remarks to share with the folks who are still with us. Karen and Fred.
All right. I just want to, again, thank our international solidarity committees. I think this is the start of something that is much needed in this union, and bringing our regions together to talk about solidarity across the globe is really important. And nothing is more pertinent than the issues that are occurring for our friends in Palestine. And so when Resolution 70 does hit the floor, I certainly encourage all of our delegates to vote yes. Make sure you push the pro mic button right away as soon as you can if you want to get in line and speak. And like I said, I really hope that international solidarity committees across the country can come together so that we can build solidarity amongst ourselves to do more, and to be active in supporting the positions that we take on the convention floor. Thank you.
Thanks. So Fred, you're good? Yeah, okay. And Rory, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you, Kimberly. And just before I will be brief, and my comrades on the NEB are laughing at that. But I want to thank you, Kimberly, Anna, Mo, Farid from the International Solidarity Committee on Cupe, Ontario, of course, the International Solidarity Committee of Cupe BC. This is such an important thing, and it's a webinar, and what does that mean? But this is a brave thing to do, and I can't thank Cupe Ontario and Cupe BC enough, and of course Mo and Farid and Anna for speaking tonight, because it can be daunting, and then there's a lot of stuff against this. But I talked about it a little bit earlier. I don't believe you get to pick and choose what causes. I think if we're activists and we're labor activists and I'll just say socialists, and we want to change the world, then you have to focus on this. And one thing I'll say, there's so much to talk about when you talk about Palestine, but when I was there were so many things that chilled me about it and made me angry when I was looking at the occupation. But one thing was it's you can look at it as an incubator, as a place to test out repression for the rest of the world. And I want people to think about that, because there are many tactics that start out in Israel and many ways of oppressing people that you then find in other parts of the world, particularly here in North America. And the reason I'm talking about this is I have been asked many times before I went to Palestine and after I came back from Palestine, why do you keep talking about this? What does our union have to do with this? Why are you talking about this incredibly controversial subject? Why don't you stop talking about it? Because if we don't confront what's going on there, I don't believe we're living up to our values, and I thank you all for living up to that. But I'll tell you, it's coming here next. Okay, and I know that sounds a little bit, maybe a little bit ominous, and maybe it's a question, what are you thinking about, Rory? But I had that feeling so strongly. And what we are confronting as trade unionists is a concerted effort over many decades to oppress working people, to oppress the vast majority of the population. And I am standing against it and will stand against it. But yeah, the place to confront it is in Palestine and Israel, and then we can confront it here as well. So thanks for everybody for being here tonight.
Thank you, Rory. Anna?
Yeah, thanks so much to Cupe and the co-panelists for having me tonight. It's always so great to get to talk with folks about these issues. I think, one final thought I'd like to leave the room with is just, I think it's really important as Jewish people to recognize the way that anti-Semitism, as real and as daunting and as important and impactful as it is, it can oftentimes be used as this sort of boogeyman to get Jews to isolate themselves from others, right? And I think that we see this particularly in the case of Israel and Palestine, where Jews are constantly being told that our humanity and our safety is directly in conflict with others, right? But I think that we know, from the labor movement, from other social movements, that we're stronger together, right? And it's really that solidarity that brings us safety.
Yes, thank you so much, Anna. And Mo.
I don't have too much to add. I think my fellow co-panelists, QP Ontario, QP BC, QP Alberta, the whole QP nationally, much appreciation to all of you and all of the staff persons who have contributed to this. I urge folks, comrades and siblings to make the right choice. Even beyond this, I urge you to always be on the side of labor, be in your labor movement, be on the side of human rights, be on the side of justice. The fight doesn't end at one resolution. A resolution is just a singular part of our struggle. So we'll be side by side in that struggle for decades to come. And I hope to see all of you in person. I hope to continue the fight and the camaraderie alongside all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mo. Thank you, everyone. In the words of Black feminist June Jordan, who is one of my ancestral mentors, she wrote in her poem, Moving Towards Home, in solidarity and with solidarity with Palestinian peoples. And she said, I was born a Black woman, and now I am become a Palestinian. Against the relentless laughter of evil, there is less and less living room. And where are my loved ones? It is time to make our way home. So from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And I thank all of you for being with us and for sharing space. And for CUPE members, we will see you at National Convention next week. Have a beautiful rest of your day, and we will talk to you. Take care.